I used to tell myself I stayed late because I cared about the work. Because deadlines mattered. Because someone had to make sure the reports were clean, the numbers aligned, the presentations polished. I told myself a lot of things in those days. But the truth, the one I couldn't admit even to myself, was simpler and sadder than any excuse I invented. I stayed late because going home meant walking into silence. It meant microwaving dinner for one, scrolling through shows I'd already seen, listening to the hum of my own thoughts until I couldn't stand them anymore. At least the office had the fluorescent lights. At least it had the sound of computers shutting down, the distant whoosh of the cleaning crew's vacuum, the illusion of purpose. And at least, on certain nights, it had him. Not that I planned it that way. Not that either of us ever said it out loud. But loneliness recognizes itself, even across a dim hallway. Even in the reflection of darkened windows that turned the cityscape into something beautiful and unreachable. It started the way these things always start, accidentally, innocently, with no weight attached. I'd stayed past 8 on a Thursday in March, finishing a quarterly review that could have waited until morning but that I convinced myself couldn't. The office was mostly empty by then, just the low hum of the HVAC system and the blue glow of my monitor casting shadows across my desk. I heard footsteps in the hallway and assumed it was security making rounds. But then I saw him pass by my doorway, pause, backtrack. He leaned against the frame with a tired smile, the kind that said he understood exactly why I was still there because he was still there too. We'd worked in the same department for 2 years by then, exchanged pleasantries at meetings, shared the occasional complaint about management decisions over coffee. He was married. I knew that from the silver band on his left hand, from the family photo on his desk. That I'd noticed without meaning to. I was divorced 3 years out from signatures on paper that supposedly meant closure, but really just meant I'd moved my loneliness from one address to another. He asked if I wanted company for a coffee run. Not a date. Not even an invitation, really. Just an acknowledgement that we were both here, both awake, both postponing something neither of us wanted to name. I said yes. We walked to the break room together, our footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, the way they always did after hours, giving everything a strange underwater quality. He made jokes about the coffee machine, about how it seemed to brew something progressively worse with each passing hour, as if punishing those of us who refused to go home. I laughed, and it surprised me how easy it was, how natural. We stood there by the counter, styrofoam cups, warming our hands, talking about nothing important. Television shows, weekend plans that sounded perfectly fine and perfectly hollow. The kind of conversation you have when you're testing the waters, seeing if the other person feels it. Too, that specific species of loneliness that comes from having a life that looks acceptable from the outside, but feels like an empty room from within. He told me he'd been thinking about taking up running again, something he used to do before kids and mortgages, and the weight of accumulated years made everything feel heavier. I told him I'd been meaning to call old friends, the ones I'd lost touch with somewhere between the divorce and the rebuilding, but that I never quite managed to pick up the phone. We both knew we were talking about the same thing without saying it directly. We were talking about how easy it is to disappear into your own life, to wake up one day and realize you've become a stranger to yourself. After that night, it became a pattern. Not every evening, but often enough that I started to notice when his car was still in the parking lot when I left. Often enough that I found myself staying a little later on nights when I knew he'd be there. We never planned it, never sent messages or made arrangements. But there was an understanding between us, unspoken and therefore safer, that after 8 o'clock, the office became a different place. A place where we could talk without the performance required during daylight hours. Where we could admit to things we'd never say in front of others. He told me about his marriage not in a way that vilified his wife, but in a way that painted a picture of two people who'd built a life together and then forgotten why, how they moved around each other like roommates, efficient and polite and completely separate, how he sometimes felt more alone in his own house than he did anywhere else. I understood that feeling so completely it made my chest ache. I told him about my ex-husband, about how the divorce had been amicable and bloodless. And somehow that made it worse, because it meant there hadn't been enough left between us to even fight over. How I'd spent 3 years trying to convince myself that being alone was a choice, a form of independence, when really, it was just what happened when you stopped knowing how to let people in. The conversations deepened. We talked about dreams we'd abandoned, about the gap between who we thought we'd become and who we actually were, about parents aging and time passing and the quiet panic that sets in when you realize you're running out of years to course correct. We talked the way people talk when they've decided that honesty is less dangerous than the alternative, when they've already crossed some invisible line and figured they might as well see what's on the other side. I looked forward to those nights, not in a way I was proud of, but in a way I couldn't deny. I started checking the parking lot before I left, feeling a small rush of something: relief, anticipation, guilt when I saw his car still there. Started choosing outfits in the morning with the thought that he might see them. Started crafting reasons to walk past his office, to catch his eye, to confirm that this thing between us, whatever it was, still existed. It wasn't sexual, or at least, that's what I told myself. It was recognition. It was seeing myself reflected in someone else's eyes and remembering that I existed beyond the roles I played, beyond the competent professional who never asked for help and never admitted to needing anything. With him, in those late night hours, I could be uncertain. I could be sad. I could be honest about the fact that I didn't have it all figured out, that most days I was just pretending to know what I was doing. And he could be those things too. That's what made it dangerous. There was a night in May when everything shifted. I'd stayed late working on a presentation that was due the next morning, though in truth I could have finished it from home. He appeared in my doorway around 9, looking tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He asked if I wanted to take a walk. The building had a rooftop terrace that was technically closed after hours, but the door was never locked, and sometimes the security guards looked the other way. We took the elevator up in silence, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, and stepped out into the night air. The city spread out below us, all lights and distance, beautiful in that way. Cities are when you're high enough above them to forget about the traffic and the noise and the daily grind. We stood at the railing, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him beside me. He told me his wife had asked for a separation. Not a divorce, not yet, but space. Time to figure out if there was anything left worth saving. He said it calmly, almost clinically, but I could hear the fracture underneath. Could see it in the way he gripped the railing, in the way he stared out at the city, as if trying to find answers in the skyline. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt guilty, as if our late-night conversations had somehow contributed to this unraveling. Even though I knew that wasn't how it worked. Marriages didn't fall apart because of coffee in break rooms and rooftop confessions. They fell apart slowly, over years of small silences and accumulated disappointments. But another part of me felt something else, something I didn't want to name because naming it would make it real. It felt like possibility, like a door opening, like maybe I wasn't alone in this recognition, in this wanting something different. He turned to look at me then, and I saw my own loneliness reflected back at me in his eyes. He told me I was the only person he could talk to anymore. The only one who understood what it felt like to go through the motions, while feeling like you were disappearing a little more each day. He said it simply, without drama, but it landed with weight. Because I felt the same way. Because in those late night hours, talking to him, I felt more alive than I had in years. More seen, more understood, more myself. We stood there for a long time, the city humming below us, the night air cool against our skin. I wanted to reach for his hand, wanted to close the small distance between us, and let whatever was building finally happen. But I didn't, because despite everything, despite the loneliness and the connection and the way my heart was pounding, I knew that crossing that line would change everything, would turn this safe space we'd created into something else. Something with consequences and complications and guilt. Would mean becoming the person who justified her choices with explanations about emotional abandonment. And how marriages end long before anyone files papers. I didn't want to be that person. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't ready to admit it yet. So instead I told him I was sorry. That I hoped he and his wife could find their way back to each other. Even though part of me didn't hope that at all. He nodded, gave me a sad smile that said, he understood all the things I wasn't saying. We went back downstairs. He left shortly after. I stayed at my desk another hour, staring at my computer screen without seeing it, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. But of course, everything had changed. After that night, the dynamic between us became charged with something we couldn't ignore. The conversations continued, but now they carried an undercurrent of awareness, of things unsaid. When he looked at me, I felt it everywhere. When our hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same document, the contact lingered longer than it should have. We started taking more walks, finding excuses to be away from our desks. Away from the cameras and the colleagues and the fluorescent lights. We'd wander the parking garage, talking in circles. Both of us dancing around what we actually wanted to say. He told me once that I made him feel like himself again. Not the version of himself that had learned to be quiet and accommodating and tired, but the version he'd been before, curious, hopeful, alive. I told him he did the same for me. And it was true. With him, I wasn't the divorced woman who'd failed at marriage, wasn't the professional who stayed late to avoid her empty apartment. I was just myself, messy and uncertain and allowed to be both. The guilt started then. Not dramatic, crushing guilt, but the quiet, persistent kind that sits in your stomach and reminds you at random moments that you're playing with fire. I'd lie awake at night thinking about his wife. About whether she knew about our conversations, about whether I'd become the other woman. Without ever actually crossing any physical lines. I told myself it was just friendship, just connection. Just two people helping each other through a difficult time. But I knew better. Knew that emotional infidelity could be just as corrosive as the physical kind. Maybe more so because it's harder to define, harder to defend against. I thought about ending it, about setting boundaries, about going back to being just colleagues who exchanged pleasantries at meetings. But then I'd see him in the hallway, would catch his eye across the conference room. And the thought of losing this connection felt unbearable. So I let it continue. Let it grow. Let myself fall into something I couldn't name, and didn't want to examine too closely. It came to a head on a Friday in June. Most of the office had left early for a long weekend, and the building was quieter than usual, almost haunted. I'd planned to stay late finishing a project, but really, I was waiting to see if he'd be there too. He was. He appeared in my doorway around 7, and without saying anything, I knew something was different. There was a tension in his shoulders, a decision in his eyes. He asked if we could talk. We went to the conference room at the end of the hall. The one with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. And for a moment we just stood there, watching the light change. Then he told me he'd been thinking about us. About what this was, what it meant, what it could become. He said his marriage was ending not because of me, but because it had been ending for years and they'd finally admitted it to each other. He said he'd filed for divorce. That he was moving out next month, starting over, trying to figure out who he was. Outside of a relationship that had defined him for 15 years. And then he told me he had feelings for me. Real ones, not just the late night kind. Born from loneliness and proximity, but something deeper. He said he knew it was complicated. Knew the timing was terrible. Knew that I might not feel the same way. But he needed to say it out loud. Needed to stop pretending this was just friendship. Just connection, just two lonely people passing time. He wanted to know if I felt it too. I stood there looking at him, at this man, who'd become my refuge and my risk, and I felt everything at once. Relief that he'd named it, because I'd been carrying it alone for months. Fear of what it would mean to say yes, to become the woman who dated her colleague right after his divorce, who'd been waiting in the wings while his marriage dissolved. Guilt for all the conversations we'd had that had brought us here. For every moment I'd chosen to stay late knowing he might be there. And underneath it all, beneath the guilt and the fear, and the complications, was want. Simple, undeniable want. I wanted him. Wanted this. Wanted to see what might happen if we stopped resisting, and let ourselves fall into whatever this was becoming. But I also knew what that would cost. Knew that office romances left scars, that rebounds rarely worked. That building something on the foundation of loneliness and late night confessions wasn't the same as building something real. Knew that part of what made this connection so powerful was its impossibility. Its forbidden quality, and that once we crossed that line, it might lose its magic. I thought about his wife, about whether she'd suspected, about how she must feel watching her marriage end. Thought about myself, about whether I was ready to risk this safe thing we'd built for the messy reality of an actual relationship. Thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways we could hurt each other, all the ways we were probably already hurting ourselves by standing here having this conversation. The sunset painted us both in golden light, made everything feel cinematic and significant. But I knew that was an illusion. That tomorrow the light would be ordinary. And we'd still be two flawed people trying to figure out how to be less lonely. I told him I needed time. Not to decide if I felt the same way I did, and he knew it, but to figure out what was right. To think about whether starting something now, in the aftermath of his marriage, and in the middle of my own rebuilding, was fair to either of us. To consider whether we were choosing each other, or just choosing not to be alone. He nodded, said he understood, said he'd wait as long as I needed. We stood there in that conference room until the sunset faded and the city lights came on. Not touching, not speaking, just existing in the same space. With all our uncertainty and desire. Then he left. I stayed in that conference room for another hour, watching the city come alive in the darkness. Trying to understand what I wanted versus what I should do. The building was empty by then. Just me and the janitors and the hum of machines. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late, about how it had started as avoidance and become something else entirely. About how connection can be both salvation and danger. How the thing that makes you feel most alive can also be the thing that destroys you. I went home that night without deciding anything. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling, playing out different scenarios in my head. One where I said yes and we tried. And it worked, where we built something real from these late-night foundations. One where I said yes and it fell apart, where the magic disappeared once we brought it into the light. And we ended up hurting each other. The way people do when they start from want rather than readiness. One where I said no and we went back to being colleagues. Where the late nights stopped and the connection faded. And we both moved on to other lives, other people, other regrets. None of the scenarios felt right. All of them felt possible. I realized then that there was no correct answer. No path that would spare me from pain or uncertainty or the possibility of making a mistake. There was just choice and consequence. And the willingness to live with whatever came next. I went back to work Monday and found a note on my desk. Just a few words in his handwriting, telling me he'd accepted a position at a different company, starting next month. He said it wasn't because of me. That the opportunity had been in the works for a while, but I knew better. Knew that he was giving me an answer by making the decision for both of us. By removing the temptation and the possibility. And the late nights that had brought us here. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me felt devastated. Mostly I felt the weight of something ending before it ever really began, of a door closing that I'd been too afraid to walk through. I saw him a few times during his remaining weeks. We were polite, professional, careful not to be alone together. The connection was still there. I could feel it every time we passed in the hallway, every time our eyes met in meetings, but we'd both decided not to feed it. He left on a Thursday. Didn't make a big farewell speech. Just packed his things and walked out like it was any other day. I stayed late that night, sitting at my desk in the empty office, and realized for the first time in months I was actually alone. I stopped staying late after that. Started leaving at 5:30 like everyone else. Started filling my evenings with things that didn't involve fluorescent lights and the hum of machines. Took a pottery class. Called those old friends I'd been meaning to reach out to. Started therapy to talk about why I'd built a life I felt the need to escape from. Slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild something that felt less like avoidance and more like actual living. I thought about him often in those months. Wondered if he thought about me too. If he'd found whatever he was looking for in the new job, the new start. Wondered if his divorce had gone through, if he was dating. If he'd found someone else to have those late-night conversations with. I hoped he was okay. Hoped we both were. I understand now what those late nights were really about. They weren't about work or deadlines or dedication. They were about two people who'd lost themselves somewhere along the way and found brief recognition in each other's loneliness. They were about wanting to feel seen, understood, alive, even if it meant crossing lines we probably shouldn't have crossed. Even if it meant risking things we couldn't afford to lose. They were about the human need for connection and how desperate we become for it when we've been without it too long. I don't regret them, exactly. Those conversations, those walks, those moments, when I felt like I existed beyond the roles I played, they were real, and they mattered, and they showed me something I'd forgotten about myself. But I also know it couldn't have continued. Know that what we had was built on absence, rather than presence, on who we weren't rather than who we were. That's not a foundation for anything lasting. Sometimes I still stay late, but for different reasons now. Not to avoid going home, but because I actually care about the work. Because I'm building something I believe in. And when I walk through the empty office, past the conference rooms and the break room, and the desks where people used to be, I don't feel lonely anymore. I feel the quiet satisfaction of someone who chose to face their life rather than hide from it. Who learned that connection matters, but so does being whole. Enough to connect from a place of strength rather than need. I think about him occasionally when I pass his old office, now occupied by someone else. Wonder if he learned the same lessons I did, if he's found peace. Or just a different version of loneliness. But mostly I just keep walking, keep moving forward. Keep trying to build a life I don't need to escape from. The woman who stayed late doesn't exist anymore. She left the building the same day he did. And in her place is someone who's learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to show up for her own life instead of postponing it until after hours.